We acknowledge, celebrate, and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present, and future of cybernetics. Histories of science, computing, and social change. Today, we're in conversation with Orit Halpern. We've asked Orit 4 questions. Let's get started.
People don't usually wake up in the morning and say, I'm just going to study cybernetics the rest of my life. But I got into it actually through a very circuitous route. I actually used to work in public health, mostly at epidemiology and kind of socio-medical health. So kind of between anthropology and epidemiology, looking at HIV/AIDS and women's reproductive health and rights, particularly in South Asia. So I was kind of working for this international development regimes and in the course of my time doing that, I started asking a lot of questions just about what I was doing. Like, I wasn't particularly theoretically informed. I did have a history background and a biochemistry background, but I wasn't like really informed. And also the internet, I'm old, so I actually remember internet number 1. I guess we're at version 3, whatever they like to call these in this kind of progressive story. And I moved from doing to doing reproductive health and rights online, of starting to network or introduce these technologies to NGOs, again, mostly in South Asia. But it prompted a lot of self-reflexive questioning about actually what development was doing. How are we using this data? So a big feature, right, is population data, the politics of that data. Obviously, there are so many problems with the development regime and sort of the kind of relationship between, and I put these in parentheses, global North and South. Those are very, very relational terms, of course. Like, I'm not putting it as a static idea, but nonetheless, this forced a huge amount of reflexivity around the politics of data, notions of progress, and the relationship and how we're understanding technology to progress and developmentalism. But also it focused questions on reproduction and biology and sort of. So I got kind of frustrated with that and decided, I think I want a degree at it. That's the first thing, right? You see a problem? No, I'm joking. But I decided to pursue in a random way, maybe because I was working for Harvard School of Public Health, degree in history of science. And initially I wanted to look at the intersection between biotechnologies and information technologies. This was also the moment of the Human Genome Project, had just come out in 2000 and stuff like this. So I started wanting to do that, and all the stuff on the digital. I loved digital media studies when I first got introduced to it, but I sort of was wondering if the question that people were asking was correct. Like, is the obsessive problematic problem of how technology impacts society going to be answered by defining what is the digital? This was kind of an obsessive concern for people in the early 2000s, how to understand what made the digital not cinema, not radio, what were its special features. And of course, part of that was trying to understand the political economy, the impacts, like whether the digital was just continuing older histories of extraction, race, gender, ethnicity, but also of technology and economy, or was it doing something new? And I felt that kind of had to be extended out of that kind of focus on what makes computing different from film. That didn't seem to apply very well to my questions about public health or questions about human subjectivity or feminism. We needed or progress or developmentalism So I came upon this term cybernetics from back in the post-war period. And I started to realize, what cyberneticians were never talking about one technology or one particular platform or one particular medium. They were just talking about reframing the world in terms of information and communication, and also in terms of statistics and probability. And I want to say a strong part of my work is really trying to think about historical changes in how we deal with the management of time and futurity, whether through data, but most particularly through statistics and probabilities. And obviously, if you come from public health, you're constantly, right, figuring out the futures of populations in ways through data, right, and big data sets. And this is something, of course, that predates computing, but one also asks how those older histories, right, inform contemporary systems of data collection and analysis and analytics. So this kind of made cybernetics really, really attractive idea for me. And so I ended up kind of dumping, like doing a medically focused dissertation to suddenly really getting into this cybernetics thing. And because it just opened up a whole world where I could connect biomedical and health questions with things that were also emergingly interesting to me. And also I'm a dilettante, so like I keep finding new interests. So suddenly I really got into the urbanism, into the built environment, stuff like that. So, and cybernetics seemed like something that could really scale from thinking about DNA to thinking about planetary systems. And incidentally, there's this behind me, I'm sitting here in front of all these telescopes in Alma and in the Atacama Desert in Chile, where I visited. It's part of my new book. I'll do the pitch. Okay, the Smartness Mandate. That we're part of the Event Horizon Telescope, but are also part of having turned the whole planet into a data collection instrument, basically for signals from deep space. And so one is really interested in these big data infrastructures. What kind of societies turn their own planet into a data collection or sensing instrument? All sorts of questions that cybernetics first led me to, and to dealing with and thinking about, as well as a real way to be thinking between technology and politics. And because, of course, the very nature of the term cybernetics leads to questions of governance and governmentality, because the definition of the language. So that's kind of a elongated, maybe too long explanation of how cybernetics came to be appealing to me as a kind of model, because I really wanted to think about epistemology and not just the ontologies of what things are.
So that's a really fascinating background, and it's great to hear how cybernetics can bring all these different systems together at all these different scales and combine all these interests. So that's really interesting. So a second question for you, I suppose, leads quite well from that, which is, do you have a favorite tool or theory or text or approach that you've gotten from cybernetics?
It's a tough question, because so much of the stuff that people did in the 50s was purely theoretical. But yeah, the kind of concept, the methodological ideas that I've been most influenced by actually are from people like McCullough and Gregory Bateson, who had a tendency to have these experimental epistemologies. And what do they mean about thinking about both experiment and epistemology together? So the first thing is, they wanted to experiment with how we know what we know. And so the idea was that you kind of open with a figure, say something like this idea of the neural net that McCullough and Pitts sort of come up with. And the idea there is that you're investigating is that from 1 minute, just say, I don't know what a mind is, and I don't know what a machine is. Like one of the things, that really bothers me about the current ChatGPT discussion is that it kind of very much consolidates, like we know what machines are, we know what, minds are, and we're just gonna, they're gonna start. It's like, how do we know what human intelligence is to start with, that we know this thing is is going to take over it or get smarter than us or what have you. So there's a lot of givens inside the discussion that also then consolidate the future of the technology, because what we think we know, we also don't keep investigating or opening up or reimagining. And so what I really like about this idea about experiment and epistemology being put together is that you're constantly questioning your very like base terms, but they like to do it materially, like through things they either invent, like through kind of like, I don't know if we would call them technical objects or what they're not objects really. They're kind of figures of thinking, like the neural net, which just is like, what would a brain be if it worked this way? And what would a machine be? But let's assume for 1 minute, we don't know what a machine is. And let's assume we don't actually know what a brain is either. And maybe we'll see what we'll learn. And the same thing kind of came in with a Rosenblatt perceptron. Like the initial impulse wasn't like, oh, we're going to build this machine that just does this, this neural networking. It was fundamentally to run little experiments, fictive ones, to find out what we could learn about the brain. It wasn't saying this is a brain. It was saying, we don't know much, but what would we learn if we tried this out? And I find that extremely attractive in the mode of thinking is sort of opening it up instead of being like, we're going to try to build a machine that's like a brain, assuming we know what a brain is, or we know that brains are just like machines, that there's something happening about the actual situation and that you're not asking that question. You're asking, what could a brain be if it acted this way? You're not saying this is a brain. And there's like a subtle difference there that might be so little between could and is, but it's actually an imaginative and huge opening, you know, and I think it's a broader question for modeling. I don't know, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of you have engineering backgrounds, you do a lot of modeling, you do a lot of, you know, you have a lot of ideas about what you're looking for. I know I deal a lot with engineers and designers, and especially designers are always solving problems that somehow are already there. And introducing the tense of could or should, that, you know, is sort of an important activity. Like, not so much like we know the world is like this, but what if it were? Like, not that our model of the city is like, I talk to these modelers in transportation, for example, and they really just never question if their model fits the world, even though it obviously, like, there's no way to gather, you know, and especially this is true. I don't know, I know people are like working on cities like Kolkata and they're using cell phone data, and you're like, there is a lot of cell phone penetration, but there's a lot of non-cell phone penetration too. And it's not true we know every vehicle in the city, and it's not even possible. And so your model is obviously a speculation on what traffic might look like in this place, not actually a representation of that world out there, but reintroducing that kind of you know, that opening of the tense is kind of something I think that cybernetics could teach us. And Basin did this too. I have a favorite story. He was always kind of doing these little, and I don't think he's a virtuous guy, by the way. I'm not on the like Bates and Love Fest side. You know, just being like, everything he did is like that's the one nice part of cybernetics. But nonetheless, he liked to tell stories and fabulations. And I think that's a really important idea. And I get that from critical Black studies, this idea of creative fabulation from like Saidiya Hartman or these sort of people where, you know, he liked to tell these, he would like to tell these stories about scenarios that make us kind of ask questions about assumptions. And one of his favorite, and he would always have these like little lists of things. And one of my favorite stories was about, and also he liked to try to think with things that were unintuitive. So when he discusses things like the double bind, which could be about superpowers locked into bad nuclear logics, or the Cold War, he kind of also brought in his observations from studying porpoises in naval research centers. And my favorite story that he likes to tell. So I find the other tool I got from cybernetics is a tendency towards storytelling and maybe a little bit fabulation, because none of the machines, none of the machines, none of the minds, and none of the science existed. So in a lot of ways, people are kind of writing science fiction, right? And I think that's the other tool we can learn, is a little bit about creative narrative and imagining new types of machines. But Bateson's favorite story came or my favorite story of Bateson's came from 1969 in a symposium on schizophrenia in the Dublin and National Institute of Mental Health, where he stood up and told a rather terrible story, really, about a porpoise that he had been working with at a Navy laboratory in California. And basically they did this study, I guess you could call it, or torture, where they were looking at the double bind, which kind of emerged in the 50s, working with soldiers, thinking about how people negotiate this mandate, like thou shalt not kill, and then you go to war and you have to kill. So you have a kind of internal conflict with there. And for these porpoises, of course, they had been taught to obey and be rewarded. So if they did a trick, right, they would get a fish. But as part of the study, what they did is they had the porpoises do tricks and not get fish. And so the porpoises understandably got quite upset. And their problem is they had two conflicting signals. They'd been taught to obey and be rewarded, but now obedience brought punishment. But if they didn't do a trick, and this is the kicker of this study, they would also get like a shock or something. So it was kind of like a terrible on both sides. You couldn't not obey and you couldn't obey, and the poor animals, having no perspective on their situation as a laboratory experiment, were naturally going what, in Bateson's parlance, schizophrenic. But the motto of the story being that to act rationally and in a set pattern following given rules might be to act psychotically. But one porpoise, however, appeared to possess a really good memory. She was capable of other things, and Bateson related how on the 14th and 15th time of demonstration, the porpoise appeared very excited, and for a final performance, she gave an elaborate display, including multiple pieces of behavior, of which 4 were entirely new, never before observed in this species of animal, and I'm quoting him here. These were not solely genetically endowed abilities, and they were learned, the result of an experiment in time. And this is kind of a process. So this kind of, and he went on to formulate that the reason that this porpoise was capable of innovation and creativity was because she had memories of other interactions. In short, she could deal with history. And that she also had ideas of relationships outside of this particularly laboratory experiment, and being able to introduce those paths into this scenario allowed her to produce a kind of innovative act in the future. And I love this story because it shows like so many ways that, again, this kind of materialist but experimental epistemology. So it's both kind of grounded in looking at the behaviors of things, but also extrapolating often in fabulations or scientific fictive ways. Both was a diagnosis of kind of a fundamental problem in society, that we're constantly given conflicted signals, and that the more we follow the rules, the more like psychotically we behave in Bateson's ideas. So it's kind of a kind of critique of that. And then also this idea of like a kind of ethics of futurity. How would we change our behavior, right? Like what are the modes and ways that we might be able to use feedback, data, information, the kind of cybernetic idea of relationality. Because the other thing about you take from cybernetics, there's a fundamental shift in the way we just think about objects and subjects, and the fact that we're kind of all interacting, and that those concepts of circular causal feedback and mechanisms is kind of a real opening to rethinking how we relate to the world, but also to the future. And so I guess that was my favorite story, because they wanted me to tell stories. I tell the story, even though it's also a really horrible, violent story, which I think also tells us the other side of cybernetics, which it is part of a war machine. These animals are being tortured. I mean, essentially, sentient creatures, and they're not the only ones being tortured in the Cold War. Lots of people are being, human beings are also being. Are suffering incredible amounts of violence as a result of, rational thinking and game theory and the application of computational techniques to the management of maybe even life itself. So I think that's like a nice story that both thinks of the like incredible creative capacities of cybernetics and its incredible violences, like that we kind of get this data through doing all these things to ourselves and to other creatures in this world.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. And it is always good to kind of hold that tension in mind of like all the good that can come from experimental thinking and being really open, but also there is always a flip side of that as well. So moving from theory, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about the actual application of cybernetics, and hopefully for something maybe a little more positive. So could you tell us about a way that either you've applied cybernetics or a way that you've seen someone else apply cybernetics in a way that improves something in the world around us?
Well, improve is always a subjective term, but obviously, cybernetics had amazing impact on a lot of things, and people have now studied cybernetics, of course, in lots of different places. But from ecology to the way we design cities, I mean, cybernetics had remarkable impacts. For example, in fields like urban planning, and of course, I read a lot about smart cities that kind of open the way. I don't know if we build like better cities. I mean, that's a subjective question, but that open the way to rethinking the city as an organic metabolic system that kind of changes, rethinking, if we really take seriously cybernetics in ecology, which also impacts how we understand, what's urban and what's rural, for example, how we understand the relationship between technical systems and natural system. I put nature in quotes, but for example, when urban planners today deploy wetlands as defensive mechanisms, or kind of rethink how they're using, or what would constitute a mode of preparedness for climate change, they're using fundamentally, ideas that have cybernetic backgrounds in sort of transforming our understandings of ecology as not understanding us as kind of isolated from the world outside, but relational. And that also had profound impacts in art and in aesthetics. So I study a lot of avant-garde movements, whether it's experiment in art and technology from the 60s, feminist praxis, performance arts, feminist theory. I know, I'm sure everyone's familiar by now with Donna Haraway, but these cyborgian ideas that can really make us rethink sex, gender, race are fundamentally pretty important. So whether it's thinking about the environment and also the built environment, of course, people had a really different idea of like what a building does, what a building's relationship is to the outside, how we live, that were fundamentally impacted through ideas of communication and information, not just inside the software, which also, of course, transformed design and architecture and planning, but also fundamentally in terms of how we modeled, or even our concept of how people exist with each other, but also increasingly, and especially in our present, with other organisms. So the fundamental idea of being able to like build responsive environments, or to use biological material or life as a building substrate, or I mean, again, I don't know if that's necessarily good, but fundamentally these ideas I feel could be driven. I wouldn't say it's the only history, but there's a a history there of rethinking everything in terms of information and communication that allows us to suddenly recognize a whole new world of activity and action and capacities. Obviously, these ideas have also transformed ideas of the human body, whether it's how we're thinking about disability or about the senses in terms of both creating synthetic and augmented sensory and perceptual technologies, and there's a complicated conversation about things like cochlear implants and all these sort of cybernetic technologies, but also just fundamentally a history coming from cybernetic informed research on the senses that many people have documented in terms of thinking about how to automate, augment, synthesize those things. And then, in biology, I don't think it, this idea of DNA as code has been long discussed. And again, it can be very reductive, but also cybernetic ideas have been really critical to people with very complex ideas of the interactions between, cellular nuclei and the outside of the cell, epigenetics, other types of thinking. So I can go on, but I think it's, I think cybernetics, I wouldn't say it's all stemming from, I don't want an origin. It's not like cybernetics did everything. It's more like cybernetics is both, is co-produced. It's a symptom. It tells us that it's kind of a discussion that reveals to us something about the society beneath it, that people started to think in terms of data, feedback, communication, control, information, those things. But it's also was a very, very active site of informing a vast number of disciplines and fields, especially in science and technology, and fundamentally changing their paradigms, changing those models, going back to my example of McCullough and Nanette, changing those models of what life could be and what technology could be. So again, for good and for bad, but definitely with a profound impact on our contemporary world.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really nice way of thinking about it. So our final question, moving from the present into the future, is, when you think about the future and cybernetics, what's one thing you'd like to see done differently?
One thing, there's a lot of things. We
top three.
For starters, I think the number one thing I'd like to open up when we think about cybernetics in the future is to start really accentuating the S in the cybernetics, which is to say that there are many cybernetic ways of approaching the world, and that opens up to questions of diversity, plurality, locatedness, queerness, decolonizing cyber. I don't know what a decolonial cybernetics would look like, but I would say that these are the sort of things we would want to ask ourselves. And I have, and I have a student, for example, who works on Edward Glissant and kind of Black radical movements that were informed by cybernetics. And we need to be doing more of that to ask how people were taking, we have a very linear story that's either an emancipatory cybernetics or an evil militaristic centralized control cybernetics. And I think we have to diversify those stories and not only diversify them historically, but diversify how we're imagining them in the future. Because right now we are in the midst of an amazingly I don't know if this is the moment, everyone is always like, this is it. This is the biggest thing. That's Silicon Valley for you. But, I think we are at a moment of extreme battles over the political, economic, and technical future and climate, environmental future of the planet, literally. And of course, not all of us have equal power in that. In fact, we don't. And there's huge inequity and violence going on. But we are in a midst where it's really important for us to start breaking into the kind of persistence of determinism in technology. And particularly artificial intelligence right now is taking an incredibly deterministic. People are either saying, we really have to stop it, or we really have to, or this is inevitable. We're going to have to go this way, and it's going to have to be, it's going to have to be organized in the way that we've been organizing it politically and economically until now. And that's just, that's technical advancement. And the levels of persistence, that technology, that we cannot change things, or we can't rethink what artificial intelligence is massive. And so in that milieu, I think it's really important to begin asking all the ways we can then reimagine our relationship to others through the paradigm of computation, because we are reaching a point where we have so much, we have reached, not everywhere, and I don't want to say that there's access, I think we forget that I work in a lot of places right now, where cell phone penetration, for example, is high. It's like 40%, but it's still not, anything of the computational penetration we would have in Australia or Germany or the United States, for sure. But I do think we have to really think about our kind of computational immersion, and try to kind of think. That's why we have to really think critically about how we're imagining information and communication in our relationships to others. So the first thing is that S on the cybernetic feature would be a number one thing. But on a broader thing, I actually like your use of cybernetics, because to be honest, it was super popular right in the early 2000s, but it kind of has dropped out now in the name of things like smartness. And I think there's something good about going back and actually remembering that cybernetics is about politics. And we are in a moment also where that governance was always part of the imagination of computing. That we have to go back to trying to understand something about data, statistics, and government for the future, and how we want to reimagine that. And so I think cybernetics as a term is itself already helpful to remind us that there's always kind of that the systems we build technically reflect and refract and produce social systems too. And cybernetics had that as a very explicit question, and also very explicit questions around control and power that were always there. And the final thing about cybernetics that I'd really like us to be thinking really hard about is how we're managing the future. So the opening, if you read any of Norbert, one of the founding people, I don't want to say fathers, there are lots of different, histories we could tell about cybernetics. But the person who popularized the term in the United States, at least, was a figure, Norbert Wiener, who worked at MIT. It was a mathematician working on Brownian motion, but it did a bit of anti-aircraft kind of defense work during the war. And because he came out of physics and this history of thermodynamics, one of the central questions for him about cybernetics, and in fact, computers only as a subsidiary of it, was managing the future through probability. He was really interested in this problem of statistical reason and how we manage the future through our technology. And today, I think that's imperative, whether it's in terms of dealing with climate change. I'm kind of one of those people who's we're not going to survive this, or I don't know, whatever. I'm not a technophobe. There's no way, we're going to have to use our technology. So then the question is, how do we do that more equitably, diversely? How do we think about the infrastructures of computing, but also how do we think about fundamentally how we're managing futures through data, statistics, and probability? And right now, we have a very, very immature language for the public, for sure, and for politics around probability. Nobody wins an election saying we think we might do this and it might work, but we can't guarantee it. and of course, we live in a moment where like that's the kind of risks we're going to have to take. Like, I can't guarantee that that those wetlands are going to defend your city from climate. I can't actually tell you if the sea is going to rise 10 inches or 2 feet or 10 centimeters or 30, right? I am dealing with statistical probabilities and planetary scale systems that we model to the best of our abilities, but we also do not have 100% control. And the same is true for technical systems. Like, we actually are dealing with sizable language learning models, sizable things whose full activity is not really predictable 100%. We're also, and we're really struggling with that, creating a democratic plural politics around probabilities. And I think that that's kind of a fundamental question, is how do you have progressive probabilities, and how do you not respond to unknowability through recourse to the kind of certitude that the alt-right offers, either the certitude of like the end of the world coming if it's evangelical, or the certitude of assigning blame onto certain groups or things like that. So I think we're dealing with pretty profound issues around discourses, again, of truth, of falsity, and of probability, that cybernetics, I think, is a language around calculating and imagining futures that maybe offers us, or should offer us, or needs to be invented to deal with that, but always thought about governance centrally and posed the problem of political organization and systems.
Want more? Check out the snack pack at the link below for bonus content and resources.